developer talk more frequently, maybe not do something that's specific to WordPress, just have it be more generic. And they don't have a web development event, a regular one up here at DoSpace yet, so we may end up making that happen. Also, if you're interested in that, again, make your voice heard. That will help it happen. Anyway, today we're here to talk about developing custom Gutenberg blocks. Anybody here not know what Gutenberg is? That would be surprising. All right, hopefully the talk a week ago got a lot of that out of the way, which T-Rave did a fantastic job at, by the way. So thanks for leading that, where we talked about the basics of what Gutenberg is. All right, so quick disclaimers, personal disclaimers. First of all, this stuff is super new. Hardly anyone knows about it yet, including me. So don't think that by any stretch I'm some kind of a professional with this thing. I am not on the development team for Gutenberg or anything special like that. I've been researching it off and on for the past month and a half, but fairly heavily over the past week. So I know a little bit about a little bit, not a lot. I do know about React, but I don't really know React. We'll get into why that even matters here soon, but in case you didn't know already, a lot of Gutenberg depends on React. I'm pretty familiar with JavaScript frameworks in general and JavaScript, so it's not a super huge stretch for me, but it was a little shaky getting into it, and if there's one thing you'll get out of it for sure is I'll definitely do a really good job of highlighting the things that I struggled with when I first started getting into this stuff, the speed bumps, if you will, and hopefully that helps you guys get into learning this stuff better so that you avoid that barrier to entry a bit. Obvious stuff about Gutenberg, or at least obvious to me. If you should be pretty self-explanatory. You guys should already know this, but this stuff is changing very, 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 very frequently. So that means that not only what we talk about today might be irrelevant 2 months from now, also just be really, really, really careful about the kinds of resources and stuff that you find online for this stuff. You may quickly and easily stumble upon information that is outdated because 6 months ago it was probably correct and now it's not. So actually I ran into that in a couple places, and I'll obviously point out which places those were when we get into it. So yeah, just be careful. And obviously there's very few resources on how to actually do this stuff out there. I came across, I think there was a total of like 4 what I would consider to be semi-reputable videos on YouTube about how to do this. 2 videos that I thought were actually pretty good. The other 2 was like stuff like this, where it's some person kind of knowing what they're talking about, but not really. So yeah. Okay, so backwards compatibility, and we'll get into this more later. I'll like kind of highlight why I think this is interesting and not a good thing, but also a good thing. Yeah, the backwards compatibility. So they care a lot about making sure that Gutenberg is backwards compatible. That may sound good in theory, and I'm sure a lot of people that do a lot of blogging and such and have websites that have like a gajillion posts on them, and they're actually interested in updating to Gutenberg for whatever reason when it comes out, I'm sure those people will appreciate that. But yeah, you're going to find that things are a little bit hacky in Gutenberg as a result of making sure that this stuff is backwards compatible with older versions of WordPress, or maybe just like an easier transition. You'll see what I mean here in a little while. But it is kind of weird the way that they decided to, I guess, architect Gutenberg itself. But it's obvious because it's for compatibility. All right, so if you like PHP, if you're a WordPress developer and you like PHP, get over it. Most of the stuff that involves Gutenberg is JavaScript. I would say good. I used to think it was more like 95% of it is JavaScript. After learning more, it's more like 85% of the work, maybe 80% of the work is JavaScript. But yeah, a vast majority of your work is going to be done in JavaScript. With that said, there is server-side rendering now as of version 3 of Gutenberg, I think. But when you read through the documentation, they tell you to use that sparingly. However, it's not going to be surprising to me as we progress if people tend to lean on that and leverage it a bit more than probably Automatic would like. I'll outline reasons why I think that's the case when we get into it. I just think there's a lot of situations that they haven't really thought through yet, and I can't think of a good way to get around those situations unless you do the rendering server side. So yeah, I don't know. The idea is if you do it server side, you don't get like an accurate representative preview in Gutenberg, which I guess defeats the purpose of using Gutenberg altogether, because the idea is, you know, more of a WYSIWYG experience. What you see in Gutenberg was what you get on the front side of the website, and you know, obviously if you do server-side conditional logic in your Gutenberg block, I guess theoretically that's tricky to do while you're building the page, but I guess you can do it now on the front side. So sometimes you end up with these blocks that just give you like some kind of like picture representation of what it is, and then when you go look at it on the front end, it's like more dynamic content. Yeah, we'll talk about that more later. Sorry, I know that sounds kind of vague. I'm just trying to lay out like a landscape of the warnings so that when we actually get into the code and start looking at it, I can easily say, hey, remember that thing we talked about earlier? Boom. Now I don't have to go into detail while we're looking at code. I can just kind of refer back to that. Oh yeah, and if you know React, you're ahead of the game. If you don't, you're like me and you're just trying to catch up. So good for you, I guess, if you know React. If you don't know React, probably not a bad idea to start learning it. If nothing else, you're going to end up learning Gutenberg, and then if you ever do learn React in the future, it'll be easier because you know Gutenberg. So yeah. Here's some useful tools that I found. Anything by Ahmad Awais, which is a couple of things actually. This guy's been pretty busy. I don't know if he's on the dev team or what, but he's certainly pretty adamant about Gutenberg.
He's a freelancer that just spends a lot of time on WordPress.
Is that what it is?
He's testing for him like outside.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, not only did he make this this boilerplate thing, but he also created a CLI tool called Create Gutenblock, and then that integrates with WP CLI. Yeah. So if you want kind of like a more modern workflow of creating these things using a CLI, using things like Gulp and just modern tools, you know, like Webpack and stuff, that style of workflow kind of lends itself to the Create and Gutenblock and WP CLI thing. In my opinion, I think the only reason that we're not seeing more of this type of stuff go on right now is that it's just way too soon, and people that are actually going to spend the time developing CLI tools and stuff like that are probably going to wait until it's done iterating so much. And I'll show you an example of how that's obvious here in a minute. Obviously the best resource is the handbook, the Gutenberg Handbook, which is surprisingly up to date. So they must have some intern that's very diligent that's keeping everything up to date on there, because yeah, that stuff on there, although it's not very easy to read through and understand, it is extremely up to date. And so whenever I ran into situations where I was looking at, for instance, this Gutenberg boilerplate and wondering why things weren't working, I was able to reference the handbook and actually correct that code fairly quickly because the documentation was so up to date on the handbook site. Cool. All right, so that's it. I thought about putting code in the slides, like say, hey, this is how we kick off the Gutenberg block. We'll use this code. And then I was like, don't be an idiot. Let's just go into a code editor and start looking at the code. instead of putting it in Google Slides, which doesn't look good anyway. So any questions about any of that so far? Go ahead and look at some of this stuff. Actually, I guess I could just get to it straight from the slide. For those watching on YouTube, sorry, I am not watching the little chat thing on the side of the live cast. So if you're asking questions, I'm not seeing them. And also, this camera is where it is, so you're probably gonna end up looking at my chest instead of my face the whole time. I don't know what to tell you. Can't win. At least you guys get it for free without having to be at DoSpace today. Cool. So, where's this slide? So here is the boilerplate thing. And then I'm actually not going to go to the create Gutenberg block stuff, but I am going to go to this guy, which inconveniently did not turn into a link. That's not even what I wanted. I wanted the GitHub. And of course, there's no link to it in a convenient place on this page. So hopefully I can just, no. We'll just go down here to his GitHub link. This guy looks scarily like my brother, even though my brother's probably not the same nationality as him. But Chris, if you're watching this for whatever reason in the future, tell me this does not look like you. Totally does. Doesn't it look like him a little bit? Yeah. It's weird, right? It's kind of creepy. So anyway, here's the create Gutenberg thing that we were talking about. And then this is the boilerplate that I extracted a bunch of code from, actually just today in about 2 hours. I thought, because I was thinking about this talk and I was like, crap, I still don't know. I feel like I don't have a super strong handle over this Gutenberg block yet. So why don't I just pick the lowest hanging fruit and I'll just go to the boilerplate code and just spin up every kind of block that he has on here on a test instance of WordPress just to get it working. Which was super easy for the basic and the basic ES Next. It was really straightforward to do that. However, once we got down to the block editable and the tweet, everything broke. So it may say 100 on here, but I'm guessing it says fix here because it still needs to be fixed. So I'm not going to do that for you, Ahmad. Good luck with that. But I will show you what's broken. So if he wants to take a look at this video and see what's broken, I'll point it out, but I'm not going to send him any fixes. So yeah, and so I got on here and looked in this code, and there's totally some old, out-of-date code in here. But luckily, thanks to the handbook, which is here, I was able to go in and kind of figure out what code was out of date and what code is in date and get it working. So we do have 3 working custom blocks in this little test environment that I have. Obviously all of this information here is useful, but there's a ton of pages. I'd recommend, after this, if you haven't gotten sufficient information out of here, I would just start with this guy here, writing your first block type. And then there's also a bunch of good stuff that is in the block API, mostly in this attributes area, because attributes are currently, the way things are architected right now, by far the most complicated part of all of this. So if you're just trying to figure out where you're getting tripped up, when you leave here and start trying to do this stuff, yeah, attributes is a good place to start because they're weird and complicated. Cool. So let's see, where are we at here? Dashboard, Gutenpress. Okay, so at work a while back when I first heard about Gutenberg and saw my first video of what it was going to do and how it was going to work, I got all excited and I was like, sweet, let me spin up a blank WordPress instance on our server, just for playing with Gutenberg. I just called it Gutenpress. And so that's kind of where all this stuff lives right now. And then I have a post in here. It's just the Hello World post. And I've got some Gutenberg blocks in here that are custom. Now, I don't know exactly why it keeps, on the editable one, it keeps on asking me if I want to convert them. Not sure what I'm doing wrong there, or if I'm doing anything wrong there. It works. So if we go to the front end of the site, like what I typed into those blocks is still there and showing up and looks great. But hey, what the heck? Did I click on the wrong thing? Yeah, so like it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just that when I go to it from the back end, it like thinks it's old code.
Which block is that?
The editable one?
I wonder if they've added it inside of the core Gutenberg that it thinks it's that. So when he produced this, it might have not been a block because all his code is 5 to 7 months old.
Yeah.
It may think that it wants to be
Something else? Well, no, that's not
the
possible.
official one.
No, that's not possible because this is literally a custom block that just is an editable custom block.
I'm just giving you a thought.
It's a good thought, but I'll show you why that's not possible because there's a whole namespacing thing, and yeah, unless they actually took his named custom block verbatim and put it into core, which I don't see happening. Yeah, that's not possible. But so basically what you're looking at is these are the first two blocks in his boilerplate. So this first red one is the basic one. This is the ES Next one. They work the same exact way, except the code looks a little different on both. And then these are the editable ones, which basically just means that you can type into them. The easiest thing to do at this point is probably to just delete these and add a new one of that type so you can actually see what that's supposed to look like, which is here. And then now we can like type what we want in here and we're good. And then of course if we update and look at the front end, we're good. But if I go to some other page and come back to this page, it gives me that other nonsense, which I don't quite understand. Now obviously these are like super simplistic right now, and it may not be obvious to you why you would want to go through all this effort to create your custom block. Well, these custom blocks are really basic. It's like, you know, what you see is what you get. The only thing I can tell you is if you want, the only thing I can see, the only situation I see is if I have a certain way I want to present a certain type of information on a client's website, and I don't want that client to have, I don't want to have to depend on that client knowing HTML, and I want to have that content styled a certain way or contained a certain way or whatever, it would be very quick and easy for me to create a Gutenberg block for that particular like type of content and have them quickly and easily drop that in there. And then now I don't have to worry about them fiddling around with HTML or a short code or anything like that. They can just drop it in and I can be certain that the CSS and the way it looks is actually always going to be exactly how I would want it to be. The only other way to have done that in the past is if you did custom page templates and then custom fields. So this is kind of like, so far, what we're at is a very solid replacement for that problem, which is instead of having to create a custom page template with custom fields, you can create Gutenberg blocks and not have to worry about how the stuff is styled or whatever, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of cool, I guess, although I had something much cooler in mind when I first heard about this, and I think we're a ways away from getting to that point. But hopefully we're on the right track, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that here soon. So let's look at the code for these. Like I said, this is the basic one, this is the ES Next basic, and then this is the editable one. we don't have to do. Is everybody looked at Gutenberg already here? Is there anybody that has not ever looked at Gutenberg before? We were at the meetup last time, though, right? You saw Gutenberg. T-Rafe showed it off.
Yeah.
Have you seen Gutenberg in its general usage, not in code or anything? Has anybody not seen Gutenberg in like its general usage? Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure, because that would obviously, it's really hard to know what we're developing for if you don't know what the admin experience is supposed to be like for this thing. Cool. So let's look at some code here. I'll show you guys what each one of those look like, starting with the basic one, the super basic one. And it's going to get a little confusing when I start to show that. Here, can we? Yeah, I'm going to move the lights. I feel like that fading effect is cool, but it also is slightly annoying because I have to wait to figure out if it's actually working.
It's getting better.
All right, cool. And then I'll try to zoom this thing in so you guys can read text better. Okay, so this first basic one, we're going to jump around a little bit here because, and I still don't quite understand why, but just the way that Ahmad was doing the code in the boilerplate, it works for the basic one, but it doesn't work for any other kind. And I guess the reason I left it this way is because I kind of wanted to highlight the difference between the two. Yeah. So this is the only part that ends up being PHP, and it's not a lot, and I'll break it down step by step. We'll kind of look at this. Let's see here. Keyboard shortcut is still good. Everybody read that? We good? I need to zoom in more? Okay. All right, so you'll notice these like hooks. There's two of them in here. This one's the block editor assets NQ. And then there's another one down here that's the block assets NQ. So like I said, surprisingly this still works. But if you go to the handbook, you'll notice that they have a completely different way of kicking off the block on the PHP side. So I guess an easiest way to think about this is that, like, in terms of like the process in which WordPress digests and understands custom blocks, is it has to start in PHP, but it's very little code in PHP. Well, relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of things, compared to other plugins and things we add to WordPress. So these are just simple enqueues. Hopefully all of us, well, hopefully any WordPress developer knows how to enqueue a script or style. But this is, pretty much general practice whenever you're trying to include a third-party either JavaScript file or style, CSS style file. So there's really nothing special going on there. And then what happens from here is we go over to the, yeah.
Where we've got the highlighted text that says handle, path, plugin, file name, file. Is that your IDE adding all that stuff in?
I'm not following. Help me point. What line?
Starting on line 31 where it says handle.
Oh, yes. Good question. Yes. Yeah, my IDE has code hinting in it. And this is PHP Storm, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. Yeah, so these are just the identifiers for the arguments for the function. And it's just superimposing those in there.
Right.
So anytime you see like a little word and then colon, that's not actually part of the code. We're only looking at the stuff like, I guess, brighter? I don't know. In green and white, not in gray or whatever. So yeah, good question. Yeah, so basically, here's your enqueue script. We're just giving the identifier for the script. We're giving the location of the of the file. We're giving all of our dependencies as an array. And then this is just where you specify a version. The way he's doing the version here is just a trick to make sure that you're always getting a unique version every time that you update the file. It doesn't work here. And you'll see in future, in the other version, or in the other block, I just took this out completely and replaced it with null. If you just put null here, it doesn't do a version check, and it always just gets the freshest version of the file, which is a way simpler way of doing it than this. I don't know, in case you guys didn't know that. Yeah, it's in the codex that you can just put null in there. Otherwise, by default, I think WordPress puts like some random version number at the end, and it can cause like caching issues and stuff.
I think it just puts whatever version WordPress itself is.
Is that what it is? Yeah. So I've noticed that can be problematic when you're doing constant reiteration on a server. Now, obviously, if you do this stuff locally, I don't think it's a problem. But I tend to do a lot of development on development servers just because I have access to them. Cool, so that's that. We do no real defining of the block itself. We only tell it where the JavaScript and CSS files are here. The definition of the block actually happens in the JavaScript file, which you're going to see is a little bit deep here, but not really, because this is a super basic block. All you're seeing here is an anonymous function, which is kind of common JavaScript as far as JavaScript goes, although it's not super common in WordPress. Up here, we're just defining some variables, and then where the real magic is happening is down here where he says register block type, which is essentially just him accessing a global class when it all comes down to it, or a global method, I should say. And then that's how the definition happens. So let's talk about, Let's talk about this register block type like method here a bit. I want to talk about this a bit because it gets a little confusing in the future when we start to look at newer code. So this is obviously a method in JavaScript to register the block type. However, there's now a method to do this in PHP as well, which is the preferred way of doing it. And you still have to do this. So you have to register the block type in PHP and in JavaScript now. I'm not sure why they're doing it that way, but they are. And then up here in the top is basically where we're defining all the basics of the block itself. So here's what it's called, here's the icon it should have, and then here's the category that this block should reside in, which really only matters when you're actually digging around and trying to find the block type. So let's, kind of put apples to apples here. So essentially when we click add block here, that's what defines what this ends up being like. So what icon is in that box, what the name is down here, and then obviously this most used is dynamic, but which one of these categories here the block resides in. And so we're telling it common so that it ends up in this common blocks thing. And there you see the basic one and the ES Next and the editable are all inside this common one. So that's all that does, is it just kind of squares away your basics about the block. Whoops. So that you can kind of tell WordPress the simple stuff. All right, so now we've got essentially just some other parameters here. We're just passing in some methods for the edit and save. I found it very interesting that this is a lot like how we do custom fields in WordPress. Or at least a way that you add custom fields in WordPress. Obviously, if you're using advanced custom fields, then you're not doing it this way. But if you add custom fields through code, there's only two ways to do it. And this one kind of being like the older, more common way that I see of people doing it, where you've got like one method that's responsible for laying out what the custom field is supposed to look like in the admin, and then one method that's supposed to handle the saving of the data associated with that custom field. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. It's almost the same architecture. Obviously, this is JavaScript and not PHP, so it's not exactly the same thing. But you know, the strategy is the same for handling the data. So to put it in layman's terms, and this will make a lot more sense after I say this because I'm going to go into more detail, but down here is what it's going to look like on the front end, and up here is what it's going to look like in the back end. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, okay, wait a second, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, Rob, because aren't both of these things happening in the back end if we're editing and then saving, right? Doesn't the saving happen in the admin? We're obviously not saving on the front end, so why is this block representative of the front end? I'm so glad somebody asked that question. Thank you for answering or asking. I'm going to answer it now. So this comes back to the backwards compatibility thing. Has anybody here actually dug into Gutenberg at all before today? Okay, good. That means if I say something slightly wrong, nobody will correct me. Thank you. So here's how kind of the magic works, okay? Is everybody here familiar with what the database structure is for a post? Like, has anybody dug into the database? Raise your hand if you've dug into the database for a WordPress site and looked at the posts table and looked at the columns in there. Have you guys have all done that? Okay. So if you've done that, you know that there's a column in there called post content, right? And when we're in the loop for a post, we can just type the content or get _ the content, right? And literally all that does is just retrieves that column from the table, okay? The reason why this bottom one, the save method, is exactly representative of what you're going to see from the front end is because what this does is essentially what Gutenberg is doing is it's taking whatever you're seeing in the back end and it's writing it into the post content column the same way it's always been doing for the past 15 years, except it's using some of this data here to insert comments above, below, sometimes inside of this content, and essentially uses those comments within the post content to decipher stuff. So we're using HTML comments to kind of meta structure the post content, if that makes any sense. This is how they're able to make it backwards compatible with previous stuff in WordPress. So this is T-Rave. This is why the other day, when you were showing off content that was already in an older version of WordPress, and then you fired up Gutenberg, you activated Gutenberg, and then you opened up the same post, it actually automatically loaded that stuff into a block automatically in Gutenberg. This is how they're able to do that kind of stuff, is they're literally just using comments in HTML that are automatically managed by Gutenberg. So when you break it all down, all Gutenberg is really doing, all Gutenberg is an HTML comment manager. So that, when I discovered that after a good week and a half of trying to learn Gutenberg, instantly made me understand what the heck was going on way faster. Why they don't make that more obvious right out the gate? My theory is that because they realize this is kind of a hacky way of dealing with backwards compatibility, in my opinion. Now, I'm sure all of the WordPress people are going to come after me with pitchforks if they ever see this. They probably won't, but if they do, they probably will. And I don't work on the Gutenberg development team, so maybe there is no better way to deal with the backwards compatibility or whatever. Maybe this is the most graceful way to do it. I'm not sure. But in my opinion, just coming at it from a developer standpoint and just trying to learn this stuff, yeah, in my opinion, that's a really, really, really hacky way of dealing with backwards compatibility, is to create this thing that's supposed to, make a rich text editing experience, and all it's really doing is just translating HTML comments into, I don't know, essentially custom field functionality that's just powered by JavaScript. In all reality, that's really what it is. I'm sure some other professional can come up with a way better explanation than me, but that's the way that it makes most sense to me. So that's why we're having to pass this tag type here. This is like a required thing. This is not like some optional thing like, oh, it just so happens I'm building this type of block, I gotta supply the P tag or whatever, I gotta tell it what tag to look for in here. No, this is like literally how it determines how it's gonna split up everything into different blocks, is you're saying, here's the tag type P. And it could be a H2, H3, H4, H5, a div, whatever. You can make it whatever you want. But in this case, it's a P. And then we're just telling it, here's the class name we want it to have. And then here's just the string of text that we want to be inside of that div. Then through the magic of JavaScript, it turns it into something. So we're telling it how to read and write the comments into HTML of the post content.
So I'm gonna guess that props parameter would be custom stuff that the editor has done, if I clicked to make text italic or something like that, or
Correct.
provide a custom class or things along those lines. Is that right?
Yes. So it's basically short for properties. If any of you guys are developers and don't know that, it's short for properties. It's pretty common vernacular in programming. But yeah, it's just properties, and obviously different block types can have different properties. I'm not going to go super deep today into how much of that we can do for a couple of different reasons. A, I'm still not super good at it, okay? And B, if anything's likely to change in the future, I think it's that. So yeah, I don't think it's worth exploring that too much. It's pretty self-explanatory though. That tells it what class to put on that P tag, so that later on we can write our CSS to style it however we want to style it, which is the whole point of blocks in the first place, is we can individually style pieces of the content as developers.
So at the right edge of those two lines,
I can scroll over to the right, yeah, if you want, yep.
But there are comments, and you're saying those are the comments.
No, don't.
I'm not saying that.
No, thank you for asking. That's a good question. These comments are just the code comments.
That's just the developer put comments in okay.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. This is not what it looks like in the database, but in the database, because these are PHP comments.
Yeah.
HTML comments look different.
The less than
exclamation point,
dash dash, yeah.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't have a good example of what it would look like if you actually looked at the database table, but yeah. Now I suppose there's a few different reasons for this, not just because I couldn't think of a better way. For instance, if I wanted to get the content of a post using the REST API on a different website, they would still need to have a way to generate raw HTML of a Gutenberg made page or post, right? How else would they be able to provide that to me through the REST API? And so I guess as somebody who writes a lot of API developed software, I guess I kind of like that in a way. I like that Gutenberg doesn't break that because I like the fact, and I think all of us should like the fact that after Gutenberg comes out, we still have a way to be able to send and receive the content in the way that we originally formatted it in its actual format, instead of having to worry about all the variables that come with converting it into a giant JSON object or something like that. Any questions on this so far? Because this is about as simple as it gets. If you're confused already, strap in. But yeah, this is pretty simple. I mean, at this point, we're not even allowing the user to dictate the text that's in the block. We're hard coding the text that's going to be in the block. Okay? So does everybody understand that? Are we good? Are we all on the same page? I don't want to lose anybody. Okay. All right, good. So let's go to now the ES Next. All this is essentially what this is. We're talking about ES6. So they're just using some ES6 jazz in here. It's a different build process, it looks like. We got some Webpack action going on in here. And that's all there is there. If you don't know what Webpack is, if you're not familiar with ES6, just don't even concern yourself with this part of it. You don't have to know it. It's not required to write Gutenberg blocks. And I don't think they're going to make it required in the near future either. So it's just an option for people that prefer that workflow, I suppose. All right. So I'm going to leave this older block open so that we can do some comparison. But we'll go into this editable one, which I have already laboriously gone through and altered to make it work. Because if you look at the code that's on Ahmad's thing here, it's out of date. Ahmad, you need to update your code, bro. It's out of date. So what is this? So yeah, this is the block editable right here. And so this is the code we're about to, well, this is what the code used to look like. And it doesn't look like that anymore, at least the PHP side of the code. Even the PHP needs to be different. So you'll notice he's doing a lot of the same stuff here. You got your block editor assets hook. You've got your block assets hook. And so he's just triggering off a couple hooks that trigger a couple methods, or I guess functions in this case, because this is a class. And he's not using object-oriented programming. Shame on him. And so that's that. And then if we go and we look at the JavaScript file, there's going to be some rather obvious differences here as well. I'll point out some of them right out the gate. First of all, I totally omitted this I18N stuff. All that's for is for translation or internationalization or whatever. Translation. I stripped out some of this other stuff which wasn't necessary anymore. The register block type is still extremely necessary, and you're going to notice some dramatic differences in the edit and save functions, mostly dealing with how he's creating these variables and doing this return L business. Okay, so let's look at what I got in order to make it work. Just throw it at the bottom. Oh, looks like I just kept this stuff up here for some reason, although I don't need it. So I could probably delete all that and be good. But essentially what it all comes down to is that I was able to consolidate. As a matter of fact, just for simplicity and so that nobody gets confused or doesn't believe me, we'll just delete all of this here. It's no longer necessary. Oh, you know what? I take that back. Wait, do I? Nope, we're good. Just kidding. This is fine. Okay. So now instead of doing all of those hooks. We just have the one hook, and instead of being hooked into those custom actions, we're just going straight into the init, and then I'm just calling this method or this function that I called. And then what I'm doing here is instead of enqueuing the styles in the scripts, I'm registering them. And then I'm referring to them down here in the register block type. I guess, so let me rephrase like what I talked about earlier. I said I didn't know why they have register block type in PHP and in the JavaScript. If you look at the syntax, it's pretty obvious that they're doing two totally different things. So what the register block type here is doing is it's literally just defining all of the things that PHP needs to know about when it comes to the block type. So in this case, it's the scripts and the styles. Now there's other stuff that you can also define in this array, and we'll talk about that towards the end, because that gets into the dynamic content blocks. But yeah, this is just lining up all the stuff that PHP needs to know. I can't think of a better way to define that. It's just stuff that only PHP can do. And I guess that's not technically true either, because you could do this with JavaScript as well, but for whatever reason we're doing it in PHP. So just do it that way. I don't know. Because this is the way we've always been taught in WordPress, that you include external CSS files and JavaScript files, is you always enqueue them or register them. And so that's how you're supposed to do it, and so that's how it's doing it. Technically you can do that in JavaScript, but I'm trying to think of whatever. I'm sure the developers have a really good reason for continuing to do it in PHP and not using JavaScript to do that.
I would guess so WordPress can manage your dependencies and order of loading and all that stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're probably right. Yeah, absolutely. So there's that. And if you go, just so you guys don't think I'm being like a weird, we need to do it my way and nobody else's way type of person. If you go and look at the Gutenberg Handbook, come on now, which tab is it in? And you go down to create block types, writing your first block type. They do it the same exact way. In here, that's how I even knew how to fix the problem in the first place, because it was throwing a whole bunch of weird React errors at me that I couldn't even decipher. And so I just decided to go through the handbook and see how they're doing it in here. And since it was a relatively easy block, it didn't take me long to like notice the differences. And so I just did it the way that they're doing it in the handbook.
Just to clarify, so this is what actually makes WordPress aware of this block, so that when you go into the Gutenberg editor,
It's there.
it's available.
Correct.
And a second question from earlier, the icons you choose from, are those all just the standard WordPress dash icons or whatever?
I don't believe you're limited to just the dash icons, but I think that's what most people are using right now. I am almost 100% certain that you should be able to use Font Awesome icons or any other kind of icon library if you simply enqueue them at the right time. Don't quote me on that, but for now, just like the rest of the WordPress admin, it is easiest to just use dash icons, yeah, or dash icons, or how I like to say dash icons, because I don't know, it sounds funner than dash icons. So yeah, good questions, both of them. Any other questions so far? No? Good. Cool. So there's the PHP side of things. That just points at all the necessary files for it to keep going. Obviously, the most important of all those files is this one right here, which is the same, which is a reference to this guy here, which is this, which is that.
So would it be correct to say that you're basically like enqueuing the JavaScript file with PHP, but when it comes time to actually like work with the block, WordPress is going to go straight to that JavaScript file that you've enqueued?
That's a very simplified way of thinking about it, I suppose. Mostly because what you have to keep in mind, you got to realize what Gutenberg is actually doing. Again, all Gutenberg is it's an HTML comment manager that uses React and essentially a newly coded editor to give you, I guess, more of a user interface to work with.
Sure.
Right? So kind of, yes, that's a way of thinking about it, but it goes a lot deeper than that simply because we're using React and I guess because we're depending on other things, it's a little bit deeper than that. But yeah, that's a simplified way of thinking about it for sure. Yeah, so if we go through this here, you'll notice I got rid of a lot of what's going on at the top compared to what was in Ahmad's original thing. I just kept the this register block type reference. Obviously, I don't even need to do this. If any of you know JavaScript, it should be quite obvious that we can just eliminate this whole line by simply just taking this, cutting it, and putting it down here. That would be doing the same thing. Okay? But I guess it just makes it look a little sexier when you look down here and you see register block type by itself and then all this other information instead of wp.blocks.register block type. I don't know, just readability, I suppose. I got rid of the translation stuff because I didn't care about it for this. I'm sure in the future people are going to care about it. So not that that's like a terrible thing to do, but for now, just to get things to work, I didn't want to have to worry about that. Because I had no translation namespace in this instance of WordPress for the GB namespace that he was using, and I didn't want to have to go create it. So I just eliminated it. I could have made it work if I really wanted to. So here again, we're defining these three things. Nothing changed. But now we're using these attributes. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, with attributes being like kind of the trickiest thing. Yeah, this attributes object, I guess parameter though, of the whole class, element, whatever you want to call it. This is probably the most important thing when it comes to telling WordPress and React kind of what the heck is going on here. I mean, think about this as like a rough blueprint for the whole block, essentially. And then we get into the details of that blueprint down here. Yeah, if that makes any sense. This is kind of the cliff notes. Like, hey, this is kind of what we're doing in this block, just so you know. And by the way, here's how we handle the editing, and here's how we handle the save. We'll go through this line by line really quickly. So this is kind of just them cleaning up how we were doing a bunch of other stuff the old way. So we're defining the selector in this attributes object, which is not the way it was being done before. It was using a global object for that, I think. And we're just telling it this is the children of this thing. Apparently you can do other things besides just the children now. Again, I haven't dug that deep, but it's just saying, hey, all the children in this block are paragraph tags. Then you've got where you're defining kind of what the content structure is. We're telling it it's an array of children, and the selector is H2, which actually probably is supposed to be P, because originally this thing was H2. So glad that we went through that line by line, because it just caught that. All right, so now we're just doing the same thing we did before, except we're doing some different stuff. When we say return, we're returning something slightly different. It's this wp.element.createElement. I believe the way he was doing it before was similar, but he was defining this up top first, and I kind of just wanted to follow the way they were doing it. But I believe if we look in here, like he's saying return L editable, I think if I'm not mistaken, yeah, he just defines L up top. So it probably still would have worked this way, but I didn't like having a whole bunch of variables being declared at the top. It just seemed really ugly. And so I just kind of shortened it down to this because I don't mind seeing this here. It kind of makes sense to me. So we're creating an element. What we do is we pass in. So how do I describe this? So within core Gutenberg, they have gone through and defined a whole bunch of, I don't want to say types of blocks, because technically what we're doing is creating a custom type of block, because it literally says that up here. It says register block type. So I wouldn't really call this a type of block, but it's like a class of block, if that makes any sense. So essentially what we're saying is we want to create a custom block type that follows the rich text editing class of block. And from what I understand, we can create our own classes of block. However, that gets way deeper down the rabbit hole, and I'm not prepared to go over today. So sorry about that. I'm sure you guys would have liked that. We'll do a part 2 next month. How about that? And we'll discover creating our own classes of blocks. But essentially, the developers of Gutenberg have gone through and made a library of different classes of blocks that we can use here. And obviously, this is the obvious rich text one, which I just realized the word rich looks really weird after you look at it for a while. It almost looks like Reich. Yeah, and so we're just saying, okay, that's the thing we're going to use. We're going to use that class of block, and then we're defining the block by the tag name P, and we're going to give it this class, and then the value is going to be the content. So we're saying fill it up with whatever's saved in the content table, and then we're defining a event.
Listener?
Yes, an event listener. So on change, perform this function. Obviously, they're just doing it here anonymously, but you could extrapolate that out into its own function written elsewhere, like any other time in JavaScript. And then same thing for the save. And we're just passing in the props as a parameter, and it's just a giant object full of props, and depending on the block type, it will have different props, although most of them are going to have a lot of the same props. And if you want to know what that looks like, as you can see, I'm console logging that out here. So if we go to that page and we do an inspect element on this sucker, I think it'll show up on the front end since it's in the save. Otherwise, it'll for sure show up in the back end, but I think it'll show up in here. No, I can't tell if this is it or not, honestly. So let's just check it out in here. See how it's doing that thing where it like asks me if it needs to be modified? I don't know why that is. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. I don't know. It's such a simple block, though. I'd be very surprised to find out it's something I'm doing wrong. Okay, cool. So I have a feeling these are our props. It says there's nothing in the content, so that's probably part of the problem. Maybe it is something I'm doing wrong. I don't know. But if we add another one in here, we should see a new one of those pop up. 2 of them, actually. Yeah, it's always this line 70. I don't know what this life cycle methods thing is, but there you go. There's our props so far. Cool. Any questions about that? Maybe this is why nobody comes to developer talks. They're a little on the milder side of things. It's a lot funner when I'm making fun of page builders. Cool. Yeah, so that's what our props look like. And obviously, it's just updating that constantly because that's what React does. And so it's watching state, I believe is what's happening there. And so whenever state changes, it updates the object. And so that's why we're seeing console log 70s all over the place because that's in there. Any questions about that so far? It's already 8:10. We do have some other stuff to go over, so if you guys are good to go on, I'm good to go on. Although there's not a whole lot more that I'm prepared to go into. I was hoping this would turn into more of like a roundtable discussion type thing, especially since Josh is here. All right, cool. So let's look real quick at how the server-side rendering stuff works. Now, I did not completely finish a working example of this, although I was trying to, but I just straight up ran out of time. Plus, Danny talked me into leaving work early, so it's mostly her fault.
Totally, you're right.
You're not throwing the water bottle at him?
No.
Oh God, that would hurt so bad. That thing is heavy. All right, so yeah, let's look at the server-side running. We'll just go straight to the handbook for that, and I'll kind of explain. I'll fill in the gaps and explain how it works. So I guess what kind of got me thinking about the server-side rendering a lot more, beyond how they explain its usage in here, is I was thinking like, well, you know, it'd be really cool is if now we could use blocks to like manage sections of pages that can only be viewed by a certain role, right? So if I could just make one page and have that page change dramatically depending on what role of user was logged in, and then I could just use Gutenberg blocks to like design how that thing looked like. I think like if you wanted to design your own dashboard, right? Say, hey, when people log in, I want the dashboard to look like this, but I want it to look like this for general users, but then I want it to look like something else for admin, but I only want these certain blocks to show up for admin and not for general users or whatever, right? I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if like somebody made like a Gutenberg system or plugin or whatever that would help you manage all of that. But the more I started thinking about it and like understanding how Gutenberg was just like a HTML comment management tool, I was like, well, shit, that wouldn't really work because it's always just going to spit out what's in content. And so in order for the Gutenberg block to show up, it would have to be in the content. And so, yeah, I suppose you could use JavaScript to like hide or not display those. But then if you just like let's say you use the REST API to retrieve the content of a post, you would still see it all in there. So that would defeat the whole purpose of it. So you would have to use the server-side rendering stuff in order to do that. So let's look at that a little bit. Okay, so here they talk about we're looking at how we created the block in the first place. Okay, now this is the JavaScript. So they're just saying register block, blah, 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 and JavaScript. I don't think there's anything really different going on here. Oh, the following code example shows how to create the latest post block dynamic block. So I think all this is doing is just showing us how we would, in JavaScript, how we would make it only show like conditionally certain stuff. That's not really where the interesting stuff is going on. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, so here's the PHP part where we declare the block in the scripts and all that stuff in the first place. Now, they're not doing any of that in here. I wish they would have, because it would have been a lot more obvious that this is the exact same place that we're doing that. But for whatever reason, because they only wanted to highlight this render callback property, they didn't put any of the other like script enqueuing stuff in here, although this is where you would also do that. So if we wanted to make any of our blocks server-side renderable, the first step would be to add this property, which has a reference to this method, and this method is called in order to render the content from the server side instead of having JavaScript render the content from what's in the post content table, if that makes any sense. So I guess, in my opinion, this is kind of like the next phase in the evolution, where like now Gutenberg is no longer just an HTML comment management system. Now it's actually doing other stuff, but we're having to use PHP to do that anyway, and so it's kind of a step forward and a step back at the same time, in my opinion. So I started to kind of create an example of this with the tweet one, mostly because the tweet looked very much like the editable, and I was like, well, what's the point of this tweet one if the editable one's almost the exact same thing? So basically what we would need to do is, you can see how we've got our script and our style and well, the editor style and the regular style in here. What we would need to do is take that example we just saw. Let's say that's the exact stuff we wanted. We would just take all this, put it in here, and then we would leave that function there, but we could simply take just this parameter and just stick it right in here. And then that should reference this, and then this would render our content, and then obviously we would delete this, right? And so I think that's a better representation, or a better example of, damn it, I keep forgetting you guys are seeing things way smaller than I am. Does that make sense to everybody? So now we can use PHP to dynamically change things about how the block is displaying. And so if we do it this way, then we can do that concept that I came up with earlier, where we create blocks that are dependent upon essentially user privileges, right? But again, and if we go back and we read this thing, it's kind of a step forward, step backwards. It literally says right here, there are a few things to notice, blah, blah, blah. The edit function shows a representation. Basically, it's saying that you're not going to see, it's not what you see, what you get anymore. And then the save function just returns null because the rendering is performed server-side. Know that, okay? And then the server-side rendering is a function taking the block attributes in an argument and returning the markup, quite similar to shortcodes. And then it says, okay, so this is how you allow the live rendering to work. You use the server-side render thing in the JavaScript. So right here, right after we create the block, essentially. So instead of defining wp.blocks.content, we simply say server-side render, and it just refers to whatever is in the register block type method. And somewhere in here it says basically like, don't do this so much. Yeah, I think right here. Server-side render is meant as a fallback. Client-side rendering in JavaScript is the preferred implementation. Yeah, if JavaScript ever did everything we needed it to do, then that would be cool. But currently it doesn't. So if I wanted to build my whole system to manage, has anybody used if menu, the plugin if menu? Nobody's ever heard of this? God, it's like one of the most handy plugins ever. If you want to make like menu items in WordPress only viewable to specific roles or user types, so it's not just like administrators or subscribers or editors or whatever. Obviously you can do that, but you can also make it say if the user's logged in or if the user's logged out or whatever. It's a really simple way to manage menu items in that fashion. So if you wanted to create like a profile menu item and you wanted to use the WordPress menu system to do that, you would just have to install the plugin if menu. And then what that does is it uses the WordPress walker method to it basically gives you more fields in the appearance menus area where you edit the actual menu. So if we go to appearance, I don't have it installed here, so you're not going to see it in here. But basically what it does is it makes it so that in here, when we open up one of these things, instead of just seeing URL and navigation label, and of course we'll see other ones if we go up to, where's our little tab up here? Screen options. If you go up to screen options, right? You can click on these, it'll add more in there. But yeah, instead of just seeing these in there, it gives us another field in here that gives you a checkbox to, basically tell it, do you want this menu item to be like conditional essentially? And then, okay, you do want it to be conditional, and then it gives you a drop down of the condition that you want it to be. So is user logged in? Is user logged out? Is user administrator? Is user editor? So on and so forth, right? So that was kind of like my concept for the Gutenberg block thing, was like, what if we could make an if menu Gutenberg block system, or like on every single block, we could go in there and dictate who should be able to see it or whatever, right? So we could do that with the server-side render thing, but not without it. Yeah, so that's the server-side rendering. And I guess I haven't tested this, but this would be something interesting to look into, is does making our blocks server-side rendered affect SEO at all? My guess would be no, because all of the content would still be in the post content, so would therefore still be coming through, but I'm not entirely sure. I guess we would have to test that, right?
I'm fairly sure Google says they index JavaScript rendered stuff.
Right.
Regardless.
Well, but I don't know if those crawlers are like optimized for Angular or something like that and not for React. I don't know.
I heard a podcast coming in that was a bunch of React guys talking about server-side rendering, and they said that it could potentially have big SEO impact.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, is that I'd be willing to bet that, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. I don't know without testing, obviously, but it is possible that by making it server-side rendered, it does actually affect SEO. I don't know. And I would say for WordPress, that's kind of a big deal, because that's one of the few strings we have to hang on to in this world of JavaScript frameworks, I think, is the fact that we'll forever be superior when it comes to SEO to, well, maybe not forever, but for now we're far superior in SEO to an Angular React Vue built website for now. So I'd like to think we're trying to hang on to that as much as possible, so that people don't stop using WordPress altogether, or that somebody doesn't develop a different CMS completely utilizing JavaScript frameworks. Cool. Yeah, and obviously we're returning null here in the save. Did anybody catch why that is? I kind of just read it a little while ago. Anybody? No?
About because it's server-side rendered, it's moot.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. It basically tells you straight up that that's a caveat. And yeah, that's server-side. So ideally, whatever you write in the server-side render, in this PHP function here, if you've done any kind of WordPress development, this is going to look really familiar to you. I mean, it looks like anything else that we would find in a page template, or a widget, I suppose, or any other kind of thing that we generate content in PHP with in WordPress. So I guess theoretically, I would have to play with it, but My guess is you're not limited to just returning your HTML, because I don't know if anybody here has developed any custom widgets, but when you develop custom widgets, you have the option. You can do a return with your HTML in there, and it'll show up. I mean, you can also just do echoes, like wherever you want, and those will also show up too. So my guess would be that this works the same way. We don't just have to return our HTML. We should also be able to echo or print R or anything else that we want in there. Like I said, I could be wrong, but I would imagine that would be the case. Or if we wanted to call page templates from within there, we should be able to do that as well if you're into that kind of thing. Usually I'm lazy and I just echo everything, but you know, or end PHP tag, write straight HTML, open PHP tag, and continue on. But yeah, I don't know. You can invoke page templates in code if you like all of your HTML to be segregated from your PHP or whatever. Cool. Any other questions? A, I feel like I've bored you guys to death enough, and B, that's about as deep as I got for now. I am totally willing to go deeper if people want me to go deeper, and we can do a part 2 of this in another month or two and get into some real crazy stuff. But for now, not only did I not have enough time to get there, but also it seems a bit premature in the life cycle of Gutenberg to spend that much time digging deeply into something that's changing so rapidly. So yeah, no questions at all? You guys got nothing for me? Doesn't even have to be about Gutenberg. I like long walks on the beach. Favorite food is pizza.
That's not true. Wings are your favorite food.
I like pizza too. Wings have recently become a top contender though.
Literally anytime we go anywhere, you get wings.
That's not true. Tomorrow is National Fried Chicken Day. I had to take advantage, okay? It is. If you guys don't believe me, look it up. Tomorrow's National Fried Chicken Day. Eat yourself some fried chicken. Nothing?
Where all these days come from?
I don't know either. I just, Old Chicago sends me an email. I look at it. They gave me a deal on some wings, and well, what are you going to do? I mean, so I took advantage of it. Somebody got a free salad out of the deal.
This is how you get me to come to these things.
This is the content
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
If you play your cards right, they'll buy you a salad.
That's right.
No wings.
No wings. We're on a diet.
No questions? Oh, here's a good time to plug. Either around the time of WordCamp or shortly thereafter,